Hi everyone. We're recording this effectively right after the Chancellor's gotten on his feet in the House of Commons to reverse a number of the tax cuts announced in the mini-budget. We're now 2 weeks away from the 31st of October when the full fiscal statement will be discussed. But one of the big moments today, the Chancellor announced that the government is going to end the current energy price guarantee in its current form in April of this year, and that they will come up with a more targeted measure of supports. Now, Policy Exchange, when we first introduced an energy plan, a potential energy plan in the earlier part of this month, we advocated for a targeted approach. The government took a much more wide-ranging and much more comprehensive spending package in the energy price guarantee, but because of the market volatility, they've argued now, or the Chancellor has announced, that they want to reduce taxpayers' liability and therefore will be coming up with a new plan. I'm really happy to be joined today by Alex Simikoff, who's the head of energy and environment here at Policy Exchange, who actually came up with our tiered energy relief scheme here at Policy Exchange. And I'm just here to speak with him about what's happened today, what might some underlying causes would have been for the government's change in approach, and what needs to happen now, and what the government should look to do as it unveils a new policy in the coming months. So, Alex, if you could just maybe run us through what's actually happened, why the government feels that there is such an unfunded or kind of unknown tax liability going into next year, taxpayer liability going into next year, and why they might be adopting a more targeted approach.
So I think the problem here really started is the short window of time they had from Liz Truss winning the premiership to needing an energy price freeze. There was about 2 weeks of that time is really not enough of a runway room to develop a comprehensive and effective intervention. In a lack of alternatives, they took what was the easiest route, which was universal price freeze, applied to all consumers residentially of all consumption levels. What effectively means is that while they kept the message was no family will pay more than £2,500 a year, was quite misleading and very problematic in and of itself. It really meant the government was allowing consumers to pay about 2/3 of what they would with the market prices. This was problematic for a couple of levels, as we pointed out in our report on the tiered energy relief scheme. One, it exposed the government's liabilities to every unit of energy consumption that a household would take. Two, we didn't know, and we still don't know, what energy prices are going to be through the winter, the next year, much less 2 years from now. A tremendous amount of volatility that markets do not love when the government says we are going to be exposed to something from, could be as low as £70 billion to as much as £140 billion, according to Cornwall Insights, who've been very good on this.
Yep.
And the most problematic of all from our perspective was that it discouraged any sense of conservation.
Yeah.
We are in an energy-tight global environment right now where, compared to our peers in the EU who are pushing very stringent targets of 10-15% national reductions, the UK had no such plans whatsoever for conservation. And it put us in a real threat, frankly, of energy shortfalls this winter. In a best-case scenario, that could be a controlled outage. In a worst case, it could be a blackout. So
we'll get to that.
We'll get to that. I'm getting ahead of myself. So primarily what tipped us wasn't any of those latter points. What tipped us was the market's response on the government's budgetary plans and unfunded liabilities. The government and the new chancellor had to take the weekend to look at where the liabilities were, where they could be reduced, and this makes the most sense.
Yeah.
So until April, the government will continue to subsidize effectively at 2/3 this maximum £2,500 a year for the average family. And then post-April, for the subsequent 18 months, they have hinted at a different scheme that's going to be targeting support. Now, here's the really difficult part, in Britain in particular, is that we don't really have a lot of good mechanisms to identify which families and households need support. It's very undeveloped compared to a lot of other countries. And once you identify those families, how do you deliver that support for them is also very unclear, in a way that isn't promoting inflation and isn't over-encouraging energy consumption. That's going to be really difficult, and it's still going to be difficult. But I've been greatly relieved with this change of direction, and it's really acknowledging what I think every energy economist has been saying for the past few weeks, which is this is unfunded, it's driving consumption, and we need a different, more targeted plan, and the Chancellor is getting us there.
So we've spoken about how the government is going to change its policy come April next year and alter the energy price guarantee to something they say is more targeted. Now, Policy Exchange, before the government announced the energy price guarantee, came out with something called the Tiered Energy Relief Scheme. Can you just walk us through how that works and why that kind of model might be something that the government should look at if it wants to target support and yet expose the taxpayer to less liability?
That's exactly the right wording, is targeting. There's a limited amount of mechanisms the UK has to identify the households that are most vulnerable to energy shocks and getting them through. We obviously have a very substantial benefits regime in this country, but we have to recognize that a tremendous amount of households are going to be having a difficult time under market prices that are not covered by benefits whatsoever, that are entirely out of that equation. At the same time, we do have benefit programs that simply are not sizable enough or funded enough to get folks struggling through market prices. So we have to look at a way that A, overcomes those challenges, but B, doesn't create an inflationary environment that simply putting money out there does potentially trigger. So we recognize that the average household at a lower decile consumes a fraction of the power that one in the top decile does. And it's an imperfect but fairly effective proxy for household income is energy consumption, both electricity and gas. So we looked at that and we put together the Tiered Energy Relief Scheme. And what it effectively does, it's a tapered system where the first tier of support is the most generous.
That's for a specific amount of energy?
That's a specific amount of energy. It's about 400 kilowatt hours of gas, 185 of electricity. And what that means is that first threshold, which we suggested be supported by 25% below the last price cap, which is
so the government effectively subsidizes.
The government pays, and so you're effectively on the hook for less than half the market rate under our scheme for the first consumption, which is what a low-income household would on average consume. What that means is that average low-income household would have the entirety of their consumption subsidized. But what that also means is that the average household in the top decile would have less than half of their power consumption subsidized. So those are the folks who have pools and jacuzzis and saunas, as pundits are quick to point to, that have the most opportunity to reduce their demand, make sure the lights are off when they leave on vacation, make sure the pools are not heated, especially not on the taxpayer's dime.
So effectively, you're ensuring that that higher income households are actually still exposed to a price signal of some kind.
Absolutely. We have an intermediary tier, which is tier 2, that is just a bit below what the price cap would have been for October. So you do have a signal where you're encouraged to reduce your consumption and lower the strain on the system, and that's almost kind of that yellow light to get you off. And then that third tier is you're not subsidized anymore. You're exposed to market prices, means you're responsible for your own demand. In developing that scheme, we also recognize that there's a tremendous number of households, those that are very large or drafty in the countryside, folks who have particularly energy-intensive medical needs, large families, and we recognize that this is not going to be the best approach for them. So we do need a targeted approach scheme as well. We put forward suggestions for disability living allowance, personal independence payments, winter fuel payments, and so forth. A product that comes about £5 billion helps bridge that gap. And I think the advantage with TERS as well is that so we had costed it out and we did some numbers, and it's something around almost £13 billion cheaper than what the government's scheme.
But this is only for households. So
it's only for households.
And Policy Exchange is working right now on a plan for business.
We are, yes, we are. We're going to have that in time for the just in advance of the 3-month review for businesses, which is now going to be the 3-month review as well for residential. So we're going to look at that. We're going to see what the experience has been over the past few months. We're going to see how quickly Ofgem gets this data back to us, and tweak the scheme. So we're going to understand, are people consuming less energy this winter than they would have been in previous years, because they are, after all, still paying higher prices even with the unlimited energy price guarantee, and how much further does that have to tweak for next winter?
So this is, I think, a really key point about our scheme, and something that the government was missing is that they basically, instead of kind of seeing how things developed, they opened up the taxpayer to a massive liability, and ultimately they're probably right in shrinking that. Which is kind of a core bit what our scheme is trying to do. Moving on, can you speak a bit more to how the UK scheme differed from that of kind of its close allies or peer economies like Germany, France, in North America, United States, Canada? Am I right in thinking that it's actually, as a percentage of GDP, the UK scheme is far more expensive?
That was one of the main problems. I mean, we're looking at something about over 6.5%. The UK was spending of its GDP on subsidizing energy consumption. The EU average was about 2.5%.
And how much, just to play devil's advocate here, how much of that is also an inevitable result of the fact that because of the way the UK's energy market is designed and operates, we are almost uniquely, let's say, reliant on international market prices, and we're very much price takers. And I guess my question is, in any case, would the UK have likely spent more on GDP? Now, and is 6% just, even if you take that into account, just way too high?
It's way too high in any event. I mean, it's irresponsible from a fiscal and monetary perspective to be devoting that much capital and liability towards energy consumption. And you point out there's a very good point. The market design we have of marginal pricing setting it, which is natural gas in this case, is fairly unique. But the bigger issue is just our dependence on natural gas for a variety of functions. For electricity generation, it's 44% versus something like 15% in Germany and 10% in France.
Wow.
And the bigger issue for us, for households, is about 85% of households are heated with natural gas.
Yeah.
Less than half in Germany, less than half in France.
Wow.
So really, it's our carbonization that has been the problem on our reliance on fossil fuels that's put us in this situation.
So can I just pick you up on this point? So I know in France, very large portion of their generation is taken up by nuclear. In Germany, what is it?
So Germany's been going through the energy mine, the transition. So now coal is taking an increasingly large part of it. So they do have a lot of offshore wind in the North Sea, but coal is bearing a brunt for them, as Greta called them out, very problematic. Nuclear is still playing a smaller part there, but
it's more diversified at least.
It's more diversified, and that's what's important. I mean, the UK, I'll give them some credit, has been pushing down the share of fossil fuels that's making up the energy mix. Wind has performed very, very well and is delivering power at 1/9 of the price. So that's a strong issue, but I would say half, if not more, especially on household bills, it's the heating component. Also has some of the worst insulation in Europe, or really the worst insulation in Europe.
Yeah, speak to that a bit. The UK is just not very energy resilient.
It's not resilient. It's not efficient. It's not energy smart. We're wasting something. There was a study that came out. In about an hour, the average UK household will lose 3 degrees of heat. In Italy, Mediterranean country, less insulation, it'll lose 1.5. So even compared to Italy, a warm place, we have half as effective. In Norway or Germany, they're about 3 times more energy efficient than us.
Wow.
So we have not really put in any time in insulations and loft fillings.
So what should we do about that?
So a couple of things. One is I think the scheme that we're currently undertaking makes sense. I think we need 6 months of time to get through the winter and then use the spring and summer to continue focusing on how can we support households that are most vulnerable, especially those where you have larger homes in rural areas that maybe aren't as energy intensive but have very difficult time restricting consumption. One, at this point, frankly, the government should be giving out loft insulations to anyone who'll sign up, double glazing, etc., subjecting houses to a check. Some folks just have chimneys that are still open and exposed, and heat escapes that way. So we've really not applied ourselves very much so in finding these efficiencies. I think this needs an energy education campaign. So we know Bayes was pushing for that very aggressively. There was some disagreement about what constitutes a nanny state. I would take the position that empowering citizens with the knowledge to make sensible energy decisions is not a nanny state whatsoever. It's a responsible thing to do, especially when you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. We did some math on what kind of improvements we could achieve from an energy savings campaign. We came up that if we achieve just a 3% reduction in gas consumption and we push electricity consumption away from on-peak to off-peak, something like 460 million pounds just this winter. If we're talking about a 15 million pound campaign, social media and traditional media, that's a great return. I mean, that's an investment you have to make. It's fiscally irresponsible not to. So I think with the new chancellor in place and a bit fiscal realities are in place, that's going to be realized. So I think we're going to get into a better place there. Longer term, I think we do have some legislation that makes sense. We have the energy security package that makes sense and should see the light of day as soon as possible, as soon as we have a bit more stability across the street in Parliament. That's going to make a big difference. But really, a lot of the savings the government has identified here, both from the energy price guarantee and elsewhere, needs to be reinvested through the energy supplier obligation, and it needs to be reinvested through local authorities and councils to make sure that they're targeting residents and households and families that need support.
This is something that's been lacking in kind of the UK's energy mix, hasn't it? It's just there have not been the time, energy, thinking, and resources devoted to resilience programs.
It's almost like a cultural thing where there's pride in being, having a drafty house. That is something you see in the period pieces about just how drafty everybody is. There's something particularly English
it's funny,
about
you and I are Canadians, so we know that, when it's minus 30 outside, a drafty house is a
we have to insulate
disaster.
well. Maybe it hasn't been cold enough here to push these in, But in all seriousness, this is really the place where we do need a bit of nanny state, where clearly the market hasn't made these sensible efficiencies, hasn't really invested.
Can I pick you up on that? Why? So I find this really interesting from an economic perspective. Why are there these market failures especially in housing? Does it relate to like the price point is actually really out of reach for a number of people?
Frankly, it's a cultural. It has to be a cultural issue because the economics are there, and homo economists would have delivered through on this, but we're not seeing it.
But I guess my question is, what is the upfront cost we're talking about here? The
upfront cost of putting mineral wool into a loft attic is something like £500.
Okay.
That's going to be paid back in but maybe a year or two.
Yeah.
What we're talking about there, so they're not huge.
So can I pick you up? Actually, can I pick you up on this point? Because I find it a really interesting one. I think certainly in this country, often the debate around insulation is one where sort of the view is you should get a heat pump, and heat pumps are obviously very expensive. And if you've just bought a new boiler that's a few years old, that's actually quite a significant expense. Now it might save you quite a bit, but a number of families just don't have the cash flow. And I would assume the majority. But I think the point you just got out there with the £500 is actually there are just a lot of measures that you can take that aren't particularly expensive. Could you? I think this would be really interesting. Can you speak through some of the measures that aren't actually necessarily that capital intensive, but can make quite a large difference overall?
Some are free. You can bleed your radiator, release excess air, and that's going to deliver some efficiencies.
Okay.
Cylinder jackets for pipes. Putting down thermal curtains. I'd love to see the government subsidize and thermal curtains, curtains you can block your windows with and blocks the draft.
Okay.
And keep some of the heat in escapes. If you're a family that's struggling to keep your bills up, thermal curtain will make a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, insulating lofts, lowering boiler temperatures. Folks who have boilers up at 65, 70 degrees is not a very efficient use of energy. It's you're not showering in 70-degree water, or you really shouldn't be. Folks have it that high. It's just energy's wasted. So I think there's obviously resources out there that help. Where the government steps in is incentives to make sure some of these investments go through. So there was a lot of talk about the stamp duty. Cut the stamp duty, focus and apply that for energy efficiency upgrades. But there's no direct correlation that obliges you to do so. So this is a place where you have a bit of a nudge factor, a bit of social engineering, where the government incentivizes homes that, especially at a point of a sale, can use that opportunity to upgrade when you go from one owner to the next. Is there a tax deduction we can offer when that realtors can help deliver? So, it's hard to do these solutions. The ones I listed are ones you can deliver in a winter.
Yeah.
We need programs that should have been in place since we cut the green crap, a decade ago.
Right.
We would have having a much easier conversation.
Can I speak to that a bit? Another place where I know you've been very vocal on this is some kind of energy savings campaign.
Yes.
And what should that look like?
So we need to be having a target of what it is how much energy we need to save this year. And various countries in the EU have aimed at 10-15%, which is a realistic number. And that about represents how much energy use they need to cut to remove Russian supply.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't consume a tremendous amount of Russian gas directly, but we take a lot of power from Europe, which does take Russian gas. So we need to call a spade and acknowledge that we are very dependent on Russian gas, one step removed. So setting out a target of how much we consumed last year and simply cutting off 10%, and then working backwards to what we can do to achieve that target is very effective. And we're not saying...
Now in Europe, have they actually mandated it in law?
So they have, it does range, yeah. So they've set out targets. So a lot of their heavy industry users who are most responsible to these price dynamics, are already going to reduce consumption. And some of these are problematic, I want to be clear. Some of these are shutting down manufacturing and energy intensive operations, relocating them to Texas where prices are nice and cheap and delivering there. So that's problematic, but they're going to need to solve that because that's the economically rational thing to do. That's not a government telling them. It's just the reality of how they're going to respond. They have told, for example, department stores to dim their lights after certain hours. They've mandated that movie theaters can't operate past 11 p.m. in certain cities and so forth. So that to me is a bit of a nanny-state goal, but really it's about
Do you think that would work in the UK context? Or
probably not. No, I mean we're certainly not going to see a dimming of Christmas lights. In 2 months, I think that's what will topple this government if folks see it gets really dark here. We're further north than a lot of Europe. But I think there are a lot of areas where we have fairly wasteful energy consumption practices, and no effort is made to curtail them.
And so speak to me then a bit about the risk of blackouts.
That's a great question.
Let me expand on the question a bit in the sense of what am I really asking? What, in your view, is the actual material risk here?
The material risk is that the uncertainty is very problematic. The uncertainty is problematic for investors, and it's uncertain for our planning purposes.
As in, So what I'm asking, do we know that there are going to be blackouts this winter?
No.
Okay.
A couple of things are going to determine that. One, fundamentally, is how cold is it going to get?
Yeah.
If we have a nice, lukewarm winter where we don't drop below zero very often and it's sunny, we're going to be fine. And we can keep going and we don't really need energy reductions. But if it's a colder winter in the northern hemisphere, we see high demand in Asia, we see high demand across Europe, we're going to be in for trouble. So a lot of the resources we currently have regularly counted on, for example, Norway's hydroelectric resources, are drained. It didn't rain this year because of climate change in Norway, so those dams are out. We've long relied on France's nuclear generating stations. Those are undergoing extensive maintenance this year to modernize them because they're getting up there in years. We can't count on that. Russia still delivers actually some gas to Europe, to Turk Stream and to Italy and other countries. If they cut that off further, that's going to be a cascading effect that's going to affect the UK. If a couple of bad things happen at once, in the middle of a cold snap, in the middle of a winter storm, we could have first situations where we're going to have 3-hour outages in certain neighborhoods to save power. And a worst case scenario, we can have a system failure. Like we saw in Texas last February, where 5 million people lost power for a week, 300 of them died. That's a real risk.
But you're saying here the risk is it's not one where we've just so subsidized the energy price guarantee that the energy consumption will be so high that it's not, the blackouts will not necessarily be caused per se by just the fact that consumers are using a lot of energy like they always do. It's the fact that actually energy supply has become so tenuous. And it's what you're saying is there's probably a high likelihood that at least one of those things does actually occur.
One of those things is going to occur, yes.
Or the French nuclear reactors don't work as well, or the hydroelectric isn't as strong as it should be.
So Europe has lost 40% of its natural gas resources this year. In a healthy, normal market, without intervention from the government, prices would fully increase and reflect that. So if we had no government intervention, I promise you, and we were paying full market prices, we would not have a blackout because people would not be consuming a lot of power. So we would have a normally functioning market that would incentivize people not to consume power, and we would be safe. But because we've distorted the market, because we're subsidizing consumers, because we're artificially elevating demand from where it should be, that's what creates the risks.
But can I pick you up on this? Is the reason that the government had to intervene in the first place was that the shock was so acute that it would be likely that a number of businesses and individuals would have gone bankrupt, and the part of this is to smooth out the very sharp market shock.
Yes. So we're trying to rationalize two things. We're trying to rationalize a socioeconomic situation where absolutely it would be devastating for households and businesses had they been exposed to those prices. So we've addressed that, but now it's a game of whack-a-mole. You've covered that issue, but you've created another one, which is just the sheer physical realities of energy supplies in the market. We don't have enough energy, so if we keep energy demand static, it's going to be very problematic. And I think we have a government that is doing its best to minimize the risk and convince people everything's okay, don't worry, when we really should be acknowledging that there are these threats facing us that we could have, for example, through hostile action. It was already seen in the North Sea, a number of incidents. Any amount of bad luck events could occur that pushes us in a bad place. Now, we've talked about an energy savings campaign of saving 3%. That could be a difference. And in Texas, the delta between them, where they lost power for a week to a full system blackout was in the range of about 1%.
Really?
California, similarly, was about 2% away in August from a full system-wide collapse where the grid couldn't handle it. So these points do make a difference. And
so you are speaking about marginal changes having a massive impact.
Absolutely could. And we could be in a place where, I'll be frank, we could have a place where we are saving as much as we can. We've reduced demand 5%, and we still go into a blackout.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And but I also want to think politically in a situation where the EU is, in these energy reduction savings, they're cutting power demand by 10-15%.
Yeah.
And they're barely hanging on, and then we call up and say, hey, we haven't really done anything to conserve, we're consuming as much power as usual, but we're getting quite tight, can you please send us some power over? That doesn't really put us in a strong solidarity perspective for them to share resources, and that's really what's going to come down to. If the EU is in a tough place, we're going to be counting on Belgium, the Netherlands, and France to ship us power.
Right.
They will have to say yes. And if they're in a situation where they feel compelled to say no, we're going to be in trouble.
Can you speak to the government? You must have followed this. The government's entreaties to Norway about buying Norwegian power. Have you been following that? And how much of a solution is this?
So the Norwegians are having a good time.
Yeah,
the Norwegians are having a very good time. Their sales of natural gas are very lucrative.
Yeah.
And they have set forward that it's not their position to distort the market and send resources elsewhere. And on a high level, I think it makes sense, because if you say, look, the EU will pay, EU, Europe, UK will pay less for gas, that gas is going to flow to Asia, where they're willing to pay more, and they've always been willing to pay more.
Yeah.
So I think the trade-off should have been, are we willing to pay very high prices or artificially high prices for many years to lock in Norwegian natural gas resources?
Yeah.
We weren't privy to those negotiations. Presumably, the UK government did not make a generous enough deal to compel the Norwegians to sign a long-term energy supply contract. And that's been flagged already. We have the Energy Supply Task Force that was set up by Bays, who are looking to sign these long-term deals, lock in consumers. Are we going to make a mistake now and say, look, we'll pay inflated prices 20% above average for the next 5 years, and then all of a sudden this winter is very warm, more supplies come online, the Russians don't do anything, we sell through without needing these better deals, and then we're paying a fifth more for years. So it's complicated and it's hard, but I think politically and geopolitically, we have not really gotten a great deal from energy suppliers. Norway and OPEC Plus are being very friendly to Russia right now. Right? They're doing what they can to take advantage of high prices and tight conditions, and that's not necessarily how allies should be treating each other. But that becomes a moral and a civilizational conversation, a geopolitical conversation, rather than it is a business and an economics one.
I mean, on that note, now that we've gotten into the geopolitics, I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much, Alex, for the really helpful and interesting discussion. And I imagine we'll be here very soon to talk about the government's new policy.